Between 1500 and 1866, roughly 12.5 million Africans were forced onto ships bound for the Americas. About 10.7 million survived the crossing. That gap, roughly 1.8 million people, is a number almost no economic historian ever puts a dollar figure on, because it isn't a profit line. It's a body count baked into the supply chain, most of it paid before a single European coin had even changed hands. This isn't about softening what happened. It was a system built on kidnapping, torture, and murder. But if you want to understand why it lasted 4 centuries, you have to follow the money. So let's trace it, link by link, who got paid, how much, and who paid the actual price. The trade didn't start with Europeans marching into the African interior. Almost none of them ever did. Disease made the interior lethal for outsiders, so instead, Europeans built trading posts on the coast and let African states and merchants supply the captives. Several kingdoms restructured entire parts of their economies around this arrangement. Dahomey is the clearest example. By the 18th century, a significant share of state revenue came from selling war captives, and eventually from raids launched specifically to produce captives for sale. The Ashanti, the Congo, and the Oyo played comparable roles. And the exchange rate was brutal in its simplicity. A single captive could be traded for a bundle of firearms, textiles, alcohol, or cowrie shells, worth a fraction of what that same person would later sell for in the Americas. Guns mattered most because they created a loop that fed itself. Captives bought firearms, firearms captured more people. Below the kingdoms sat the raiders and middlemen who marched captives inland in coffles, chained neck to neck on journeys that killed a significant share of them before they ever reached saltwater. Each stop along that route added another markup. One thing is worth saying plainly: this was never Africans as some single group participating in their own downfall. It was specific elites and specific states profiting by preying on other African peoples, usually rivals, usually the weaker neighbor. The same pattern that shows up at every single stage of this trade: the powerful exploiting the vulnerable. On the coast, this stopped looking like raiding and started looking like a corporation. The Royal African Company, the Dutch West India Company, Portugal's crown monopolies chartered businesses that built fortified trading posts. Elmina, Cape Coast Castle, Gorée Island. Captives were held in dungeons there, sometimes for months before ever seeing a ship. The companies employed resident agents called factors, who negotiated prices, inspected captives, branded them, and managed the holding pens like inventory, contracts, credit lines, price negotiations. This wasn't piracy. It was commerce, with all the paperwork that implies, and the money moving through it was staggering, even by the standards of the day. By the 1760s, annual exports from Britain's Caribbean colonies alone were worth more than £3 million, something like £250 million today. That wealth could turn on a single voyage. Liverpool merchant Thomas Leyland, who later became the city's mayor 3 times over, cleared roughly £12,000 profit, close to £1 million in today's money, on just one voyage of his ship, the Lottery, in 1798. This is the LEG most people picture: manufactured goods to Africa, enslaved people to the Americas, raw materials like sugar and cotton back to Europe. And the math here is the coldest part of the whole story. Captains packed vessels to squeeze in as many captives as possible, weighing mortality against cargo space like any other logistics problem. Historians estimate mortality on a typical voyage at 10 to 20%, sometimes far higher. The trade stayed profitable anyway, because the survivors sold for enough to absorb the loss. Death in transit wasn't a moral catastrophe on the books. It was an accounted-for cost. Insurers wrote policies on captives as cargo. In 1781, the captain of the ship Zong threw 132 enslaved people overboard, specifically so the owners could file a claim for lost cargo. For years, historians pegged the average return on a slave trading voyage as high as 33%. The most rigorous modern research built from voyage-by-voyage accounts across 5 nations puts the real number closer to 11 to 14%, still an excellent return, just not the runaway windfall once assumed. But multiply even that modest number across an entire national fleet and the totals turn enormous. England's gross margin on the slave trade between 1761 and 1807 alone comes out to roughly 49 million pounds at the time, something like $12 billion today, from one country in under 50 years. Portugal, France, Spain, and the Netherlands were all running the same business in parallel. Before we go further, if this kind of deep dive economic history is your thing, this is exactly the channel for it. Hit subscribe and drop a like if you want more of these. Now back to the ledger, because the next stop is where the real fortunes were made. Captives who survived the crossing were sold at auction, one more layer of middlemen taking a commission. And the price of a person tracked the market with cold precision. A prime field hand in New Orleans sold for around $500 in 1800 and roughly $1,800 by 1860, tripling almost exactly in step with cotton demand from British and American textile mills. By 1860, the roughly 4 million enslaved people in the United States were valued as property alone at somewhere between $3 and $4 billion, more than every railroad, factory, and bank in the country combined. In today's money, that single asset class has been estimated at well over $10 trillion. Cotton, the crop their labor produced, made up more than half of all United States export revenue on the eve of the Civil War. Economists Robert Fogel and Stanley Engerman, in their controversial 1974 book, Time on the Cross, argued that slave agriculture was actually more efficient by certain output measures than free farm labor of the same era. The findings set off decades of argument because efficient measured this way says nothing about the human cost, and plenty of historians have since challenged both the numbers and the framing. The profit did not stop at the plantation gate. Cotton brokers took their cut. Mill owners in Manchester and New England built fortunes on raw cotton grown by people they never saw. Banks accepted enslaved people as loan collateral. Insurers wrote policies on enslaved people's lives the same way they wrote them on ship cargo. Here's where historians genuinely disagree. Eric Williams argued in 1944 that slave trade profits helped finance Britain's Industrial Revolution, seeding banks and infrastructure. Modern economic historians find partial support for this in specific port cities and industries. The skeptical camp counters that slave trade profits, while enormous for individual merchants, made up a relatively small share of Britain's total national income, meaning the Industrial Revolution probably happens anyway, even if particular fortunes were undeniably built on this trade. What isn't disputed is simpler. The trade generated massive fortunes for specific people, specific companies, specific port cities, and it inflicted catastrophic permanent costs on the people enslaved and on the African societies destabilized by centuries of raiding. That cost never shows up in any ledger. It was never designed to. So, was slavery profitable? For the merchants, the ship owners, the insurers, the planters, the African elites who sold captives, the auctioneers who took their commission, yes, overwhelmingly. Billions of dollars by any modern conversion flowed through this system and seeded banks, cities, and industries that are still standing. But profitability and morality were never the same question. The entire system's efficiency depended on one fact: the people actually doing the labor kept none of the profit and carried all of the cost. That's not a footnote to the economics, it is the economics.